a panel could be convened on the question of what our French brothers and sisters expect from American Jewry, or what our French brothers and sisters expect from Israeli Jewry. By the way, the answer to the latter question, if it's aliyah, that is not an adequate answer to the problem. I'm going to say a few things at a high level of generality and leave for the discussion questions of polls and politicians and policies and so on. I want to begin by saying that I hope we're not here to talk about the legitimacy of criticism of the State of Israel. I think that conversation rightly ended a long time ago. Most criticism of Israel, though not all of it, but most criticism is an expression of friendship. Anyway, it is too late for the Goyim not to hear what we're saying. American Jewry decided a long time ago that it would conduct its business not in a Jewish language, so it's much too late to pretend that we can speak among ourselves. Thirdly, there is a double standard about this criticism. It is always fine to criticize Israel from the right, but to criticize Israel from the left is to stab the country in the back. And finally, none of us American Jews, whatever we say about Israel, will, since we do not live here, will experience the consequences of our position. Those right-wingers who insist upon the continued settlement of the West Bank will not be here during the Third Palestinian Intifada. Those left-wingers who insist upon an end to the settlement activity will not be here if the security arrangements, as a consequence of that withdrawal, will turn out to be too fragile. None of us will experience those consequences, yet none of us can be silent. Myself, I am desperate in certain of my worries about Israel having to do with the continued delegitimation of the two-state solution, with the state of Judaism and the state of Israel and so on. But let me say that I am not here to say that what's wrong with Israel's policies is that they are embarrassing to me. What worries me about Israel worries me for Israel, and mainly or even only for Israel. The Jewish community has always had institutions of self-criticism. We were taught in the very beginning, hocheach tochiach. In the Middle Ages, you were actually allowed to stop the praying in a synagogue, to deliver moral castigation against certain individuals. We are, by definition, criticizers of ourselves. We lead examined lives, and it's a bit too late to lament that fact. Now, it used to be the question of whether Israel should be an Or LaGoyim, we disposed of a long time ago. We seem to be taken up now with the question of whether Israel should be an Or LaYudim, about whether Israel should be a light unto the Jews. There is no doubt in any of our minds that Israel's centrality to Jewish life is profound. We can debate, indeed we set up ideological denominations based on our definition of what that centrality is and so on. But what I want to insist upon today, a little bit in the spirit of what Alana said earlier, is that the reality of the world Jewry right now is that there is a pluralism of Jewish communities and a pluralism of Jewish centers. There is this extraordinarily liberating sentence written in the 12th century by a very great thinker. He said, we only have a fragment of it, he said, Ki mi bari tetzei Torah dvar Hashem me'otranto, which is that, and let the Torah come forth from Bari, which was a city on the east coast of Italy, and the word of God from Otranto, meaning that wherever Jews live, Jewish identity, Judaism, and now Zionism is relevant to the discussion. And the question of what should diaspora Jewry expect of Israel, to me sounds a little bit like what the question of what Minsk should expect from Lublin. And that is exactly the way it should be as far as I'm concerned. There is a term larger than Israeli Jew and larger than an American Jew, and it is the term Jew. And it is as Jews that we gather and debate all of our communities' various problems. Now, the third point, the problem with the centrality of Israel to American Jewish identity is a very deep one, and the question of what American Jewry should expect from Israel broaches a deeply troubling concern of mine, which is the extent to which American Jewish identity has always been excessively vicarious. American Jews have always lived through the experience of other Jews. Now, if you look at the history of the American Jewish community, beginning with the great immigrations in the late 19th, early 20th century, this is not hard to understand. Sociologists tell us that a generation is 30 years. If you look at, I'm speaking very grossly here, The first 30 years of that community were the immigrants themselves. They brought the old country with them. The next 30 years, the children, well, just for the sake of brevity, they were the famous all-rightniks. They were discovering America and so on. From the grandchildren, an indigenous American Jewish identity might have been expected, except that it was precisely during the grandchildren's life that the two great dramas of modern Jewish history occurred: the terrible tragedy in Europe and the redemption or pseudo-redemption and the restoration of Jewish sovereignty here in Israel. And suddenly, at the moment when American Jews could have been expected to stop living vicariously, to stop taking their Judaism from the rabbis with beards who spoke in foreign accents because they came from somewhere else, to develop something indigenous, once again American Jewish identity was thrown far away from American Jews themselves. And insofar as the weakening of affiliation with Israel among American Jews is real, and it is real, by the way, though the analysis of why this is happening is very complicated, insofar as this means that finally a moment of truth is arriving for American Jews, and we will see just what kind of Jewish identity and what kind of Judaism we are capable of without the crutches of the past and the old country. I welcome this moment of truth. Now, I expect Israel to pursue justice. I expect Israel to pursue justice because I expect Jews to pursue justice because we have commanded to do so. I might say also that I expect other countries to pursue justice too, because Jews are not the only people who are commanded to pursue justice. And moreover, I do not expect some Jews to pursue justice more actively than other Jews. It is true that Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lazeh, we are all in some way bounded, or we are each other's surety in some way, and we can teach each other things, but in some deep way, we are responsible for our own character. We are meaning American Jews cannot expect Israeli Jews to save them spiritually, psychologically, culturally, you name it, and it is unrealistic in the extreme for Israeli Jews to expect in any way that American Jews will save them too. Hayeshua lo tavo me'America. That I'm confident about that. The moral life should be lived intrinsically, lishma, for its own reasons, and not because of its impact about how it will make our cousins feel. Now, I expect American Jews also to pursue justice, and sometimes I am, shall we say, irritated by the moral condescension of certain American Jewish critics towards Israel, because in fact the American Jewish community is now marred by certain disgraceful realities. We have problems of our own, and we are not dealing with them adequately at all. So in conclusion, I want to say that Israel does not exist to edify me. And Israel's most urgent worry is not whether or not it will disappoint me. And Israel was not created to relieve me of the burden of creating my own Jewish identity, in relationship to Israel, to be sure, but not exclusively around it or by it. Is my love for Israel unconditional? A few words have to be said about that. We were all taught that there is no higher form of love than unconditional love. I am here to suggest to you that that was a terrible mistake. That conditional love is a much higher form of unconditional love. Because in conditional love, the object of love continues to justify the love that it receives. The only form of unconditional love that we cannot live without is the love of parents for children, which is why unconditional love is always infantilizing. Whereas conditional love, the love that exists because the object of the love actually earns it through his or her deeds or character or whatever, that is the highest thing to which we can aspire. So yes, my love for Israel is unconditional, but it is also conditional. And I say that saying that there are things that Israel does and has done that sometimes fill me with concern and sometimes even with horror. But on balance, I have to say, when one looks at the history of the use of state power by states, and after all, the Jews have no intrinsic moral talent. We should stop flattering ourselves about this. One of the reasons that Jews did not commit certain crimes is because for 2,000 years we lacked the power to do so. But by the standards of state power, I have to say, Israel and its democratic system, about which I also have enormous concerns. You now live in a democracy without an opposition. This is not a healthy development, but still I regard Israel as something that can justify my conditional love. There is, one of my favorite things in the Jewish tradition is a small passage written in the early 16th century by the Maharal of Prague. and it's in a little essay on frivolity. And in this passage, he says that human beings are beings who by definition aspire to perfection. That is what we are. And then he makes the really extraordinary point that if in fact it is the case that we are defined by our aspiration to perfection, by our perfectibility, then in creatures such as these, perfection must be regarded as a flaw and a shortcoming. That is to say, it is not perfection that I ask of you or that you must ask of me. It is solidarity, it is understanding, it is candor, and it is conditional love. Thank you very much.